I am not moved by something I have written, then I need not have written it. I cannot be the same person when I have finished writing the book than I was at the beginning.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the June edition of the virtual reading group for 2021. My name is Patience Masua and I'll be your moderator for today. This virtual reading group series is convened by Ms. Daisry Mathias. She is the first and sitting advisor on youth matters and enterprise development to the President of the Republic of Namibia. Just to recognize the participants we have today, I recognize the presence of ministers, deputy ministers, government officials, members of academia, business leaders, young Namibians, friends, fellow readers from across the continent and the world. A warm welcome. Our session will be 1 hour long, 11 o'clock to just slightly past 12 o'clock, depending on how long we take. And to make best use of the time, I request all of us to kindly submit our comments, contributions under the chat function. We will keep the discussion as engaged as possible. And on all social media platforms, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, please use #ReadWithDaisry for all social media posts and content during our discussions and post the event. The 2021 series reviews modern African literature from East, West, and Southern Africa. And the book that we read this month is This Mournable Body by our guest author, Ms. Tsitsi Dangarembga. This Mournable Body is a book that accounts a haunting, inclusive, and timely glimpse into how misogyny and class strife shape life in a post-colonial Zimbabwe. Ms. Dangarembga is also the author of Nervous Conditions, that she debuted, a book that won her the Commonwealth Writers' Prize. And in this Mournable Body, the characters return. Please allow me to welcome our guest author. Thank you very much for joining us. We're very, very honored to have you in our presence to dissect this excellent read. But before that, how the program will work is that Ms. Mathias will give us a short review on the book, followed by a response by the author. And after that response, we'll have a couple of questions that we'll pose to both Daisry on her review of the book, but from the author on her perspective in terms of how she wrote the book and how that book relates to not only a Zimbabwean society, but an African society today still. Allow me to now welcome Ms. Daisry Mathias, the host of the reading group, to just give us her reflections on the book of the month. Ms. Daisry, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Patience, for that introduction and for setting the scene to our 4th virtual reading group. A warm welcome to everyone, our online community of readers. Thank you for accepting our invitation and for your commitment to reading a book a month. We're continuing to explore our modern African literature context, and this month we're back in Southern Africa. We spent the last 2 months in West Africa, in Ghana and Nigeria, and today we're delighted to be in neighboring Zimbabwe. And we are joined by the award-winning filmmaker, novelist, cultural activist, Dr. Tsitsi Dangarembga, who is my honored guest for today, and she will provide a response to a review on her book, This Mournable Body. Doctor, we're truly delighted to have you in our midst. Thank you for inspiring young women like myself to read, to write, and to be able to tell our own stories. As a recap, in our last session, we enjoyed Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, which is a timeless classic and a deeply spiritual book that describes the complex story about culture and the evolution of societies, compelling us to reflect on our own society here in Namibia and Africa at large. Today, we're further going to interrogate the themes of African identity, post-colonialism, societal norms, sexual and gender-based violence, and their drivers and effects. As an introduction to our author, our guest author today, and the book that we're reading, Dr. Tsitsi Dangarembga was born in 1959 in Mutoko in southern Zimbabwe. She's a decorated writer with a book trilogy, playwrights, short letters under her belt. Her debut novel, Nervous Conditions, was the first to be published in English by a Black woman from Zimbabwe in 1988. Just like last month when we did Achebe's Things Fall Apart, it was the first book to be written in English by an African, while this is the first to be written by an African Black woman from Zimbabwe. It certainly is a beloved and a relatable story about Tambudzai. I continue with the introduction of the author. Tsitsi hails from a family of firsts. It's no coincidence because her parents were both educators, and notably her mother was the first Black woman to obtain a bachelor's degree. And she herself, Tsitsi, continued to obtain her PhD in African Studies. Earlier this month, on the 8th of June, she was further recognized and announced as the winner of the Pen Pinter Prize for the year 2021. This is an annual award that is given to an outstanding literary merit. Somebody who, and I want to quote the distinction, the qualifying criteria, somebody who casts an unflinching, unswerving gaze upon the world and shows a fierce intellectual determination to define the real truth of our lives and our society. You will find that these words are very accurate as we get into the book. So today's novel, This Mournable Body, was published in August 2018, and it is Tsitsi's third book and the final installment to a trilogy. The first in this trilogy chronicles the journey of the protagonist, who is a young woman by the name of Tambudzai Zigauke. In the first book, Nervous Conditions, the story is set in pre-independent Zimbabwe, and it narrates the formative years of Tambu's upbringing, her culturalization, socialization, and her education. In the second book, The Book of Knots, the story continues with Tambudzai's journey into Mozambique, along with her sister, who is part of the liberation struggle, and her pursuit of tertiary education abroad. In the final book in this trilogy, This Mournable Body, the story is set now in post-independence Zimbabwe, where Tambu is trying against the odds to pursue her ambitions, her professional ambitions, to achieve a measure of success in career and business. As we get into the story and the characters now, the protagonist hails from a poor village and the family setting. She comes from a family setting in rural Zimbabwe. She's a middle-aged educated. She's qualified as a sociologist, but she has not been directly able to practice in her field of training. In her previous job, she was a copywriter in an advertising agency, a talented copywriter. But because of institutionalized racism and or favoritism, she was frustrated out of that job, and she resigned essentially out of protest, if not principle as well. The story begins with Tambudzai trying to pick up the pieces. She's unemployed. She's living in a youth hostel in Zimbabwe. And it's clear that she has faced many setbacks in her life, and she has been overtaken, and she's feeling left behind by her peers. She's also past her prime. She's of middle age, but she's becoming less and less competitive in the marketplace. So going back to her previous occupation is also not an option because she wouldn't be as competitive. Tambudzai is, I think, in personality, her character is quite competitive. She's increasingly anxious about her prospects, and as she sees her peers progressing ahead of her, she wants to get ahead as well. She moves in with a generous helper, but a troubled widow, Mai Manyanga, who has 3 sons and a niece, Christine, whom Tambudzai draws near to, Christine. Living with a widow is a choice that Tambudzai makes for the lack of a better option, really, but also the environment was not as conducive for her. There, she's exposed to a lot of violence, sexual and domestic violence, and her own helpless economic situation really settles on her and turns into desperation. And she even begins to plot ways of escape, scheming devices to seduce and to hook one of the widow's sons, who will be an heir to the widow's estate, so that at least the estate of marriage can be a lifeline out of her, her poverty and her hardship. She's also living next door. Her roommate is a sexual predator who makes advances at her, and she's vulnerable in this confinement, but she remains firm on her principles and she doesn't compromise. Tambudza is an empowered woman. She's educated, she's been exposed, she's ambitious, she's seemingly quite resilient because she's made a number of comebacks, but despite possessing everything that she needs to make it in life, she's just not able to succeed. So evidently there's a lack of access to opportunities that could meaningfully transform her life. And maybe that is structural and talks to the economic and the political construct of the country at the time. She finally gets a job breakthrough as a biology teacher at a high school, and it does not take long before she is exposed to and frustrated by the sugar daddy transactional relationships that are taking place between her adolescent learners and powerful, well-connected men in the community. She tries to intervene and to stop this abuse, which also counts for statutory rape because of the age of the young women. But reporting the incidents and the perpetrators to the police is of no success, as it's her word against influential members of the community, and the system seems to protect itself. With her frustrations compounded by this situation now in her new role as a teacher and witnessing all of this abuse, she faces a breakdown, and it pushes her over the edge, and she crosses the breaking point when she gets into a scuffle and she assaults a student to the point that she loses an ear. She ends up in hospital, and after recovery, she goes to live with a relative, Nyasha, and his wife. And there she's exposed to the cross-cultural dynamics. She's increasingly detached from the rules that used to apply to her life in town versus her life in the village. And as life would bring her back to her former advertising colleague, Tracy, Tracy engineers a re-entry into the labor market and hires Tambu in an ecotourism business. Tambu later starts her own village eco-women's club, and through the process of establishing this club, she has to pay a few people in order for her to meet her objectives. There's a watershed incident in the novel that happens at the launch of her village eco women's club, where the women are performing, doing their cultural dances, and they're topless, and a tourist takes a photograph of her mother. And this prompts Tambu, who's very unapologetic and quite strong in character, to damage the camera of the tourist, leading to her resignation. She's disappointed in her personal failures and her inability to be socially upwardly mobile. She's unable to move, to transcend from poverty to the middle class. She's unable to get the jobs and to earn the kind of money that she believes she's capable of earning. And resigned to her fate, she ends up working with Christine, the niece of the widow, in a security company with an aunt. There are a number of themes and lessons that are consistent in this book, and in as much as it is a book about a woman's journey, I think there's also an intersection between economic politics and identity. There's an interesting statement in the book that says, April 18, can we really call it independence? Really acknowledging that there's sovereignty and there's been political emancipation, but there's a paradox of freedom in oppression, the fact that they are still not economically liberated and able to prosper. There was also another compelling statement in the book that talks about another's grief is no reason to lose your own appetite. And this challenged me because the protagonist was always a witness to abuse and I think abnormal societal behavior. She was exposed at the beginning of the novel to an incident with her former hostel mate, Gertrude, who was really viciously attacked because of her dress code, and this woman suffered abuse and rejection. She was ostracized in a taxi rank because of the way that she appeared, and I think there was a character failure in Tambu here, or maybe just the silence. The failure to speak up for victims became complicity. We saw it happening again in her new residence in the widow's house, where one of her flatmates was sexually assaulted by one of the male roommates. And they were all saying, look, he didn't threaten your life. He didn't say he's going to do it again. This is the reality for many women. Get up, stop crying. And the silence, they never called out the sexual predator, the perpetrator. They never used their voice to highlight the wrongs that were being done against them. And I think that in her silence, she became complicit. That attitude of see no evil, hear no evil, and do no evil did not serve her well, because it only allowed a very destructive culture to self-perpetuate. Also in the novel, I picked up was something that is more relevant to us today in our contemporary societies, is this dilemma. It really captured the helplessness of unemployed graduates, young people who have got the qualifications, who have been empowered, but they just can't access opportunity, rendering them so desperate that they even consider migration. They want to leave the country. It's fueling the notion of poor graduates and rich criminals, that we're celebrating the wrong types of wrong role models in our society. And it really is disjointed about the solid academic outputs that we're able to accomplish in our societies, in our economies, but that our countries are not able to create the economic space to absorb this talent and create opportunities for them. And that has side effects, and we see it playing out in the life of Tambo as well. In her mind, she's looking for escapes, and she becomes desperate, and she says, look, maybe I can just consider marrying for social status, marrying for security, marrying as a pathway out of poverty. We see it happening with her students. You know, that blesser-blessee relationship is transactional. It's driven by poverty and power dynamics that have to do with money and the need for comfort, the need to access basic amenities for survival, and how men really make a choice to abuse the vulnerabilities and the poverty of others for their own gratification, as we see it happening in the book. The last theme that I would like to point out is that of a post-conflict society that is still very much traumatized, that is still in the process of healing. And again, bringing us back to the intersection of politics, economy, and culture. Rape was prevalent in the novel, but also the undertones of self-blame. I shouldn't have worn this, or I was in the wrong place. Why didn't I prevent this act? There was victim blaming as well, to say, look, just keep quiet. He didn't threaten you, so leave it alone. There was mental health issues that were really sparked by a hopelessness and a despair, an inability to see a brighter tomorrow and circumstances changing. This led to thoughts of depression and really just a community, I think, that was shackled by poverty. But on the bright side, I think it also positively cast a light on the role of support systems, the role of families, the role of helpers, and the importance of strong family bonds. And we saw that these relationships, time again, were the saving graces in the life of our protagonist. I must admit, Tsitsi, that I started at the end. I didn't read Nervous Conditions. I have it, but I have to now go back to the beginning. I have to read Nervous Conditions. I have to read the second one. What is it?
The Book of Knots.
The Book of Knots. I have to go back to the second one. But this conclusion, the end of this, this sequel was extremely intense. It was a slow read for me. I found it to be a deeply personal account of not just one specific woman's story, but it's a story that I think you deliberately crafted in the second person. It was my first time also reading a book in the second person, but doing that achieved, I think, the objective of bringing the reader in, to personalize the story, to make it your own, to feel the experience as if it's applicable, it's relatable to every single one of us. So it's not a story about one specific person. It's about what can happen to a woman in that context, in that society. And I think it's, at the end of the day, about breaking down and building back up. It's about a refusal to fail against the odds. And as I was reading, I was also reminded of Shinamanda Ngozi and Diji's TED Talk that she did on the danger of a single story. And she was really saying that this work is so important it's important for us to be able to challenge narratives on Africa. Also similar to Chinua Achebe that we did last month, he offered a rebuttal really on what was a very denigrating Western narrative of the dark continent at the time. And I think you're doing the same through A Mournable Body. You're bringing an honest and unapologetic account of Zimbabwean society with their aspirations, with their dreams and hopes, but also their faults and weaknesses. And I think it's something that all of us young Africans must take up. We must be Afro-optimists. We must be wary of, and we must challenge narratives that are attempting to exclusively paint the continent black and her leaders to be incompetent and inept. You know, that is not the standard, and it's not universally true. But we must become comfortable, I think, with factoring in failure into the stories of success, into the stories of leadership. In our protagonist, there was no room for failure for her. She could not reconcile the two. But I think we must embrace that we can fail forward, that we can continue to be humbled by our experiences, draw the lessons that need to be learned from our failures, but build on it in order for us to achieve our desired end. And I think that is what you have masterfully achieved through this novel. Thank you very much, Tsitsi, for a powerful lesson, I think, to myself, to many young women and Africans in general. And you've done it very authentically. I think yours is an important voice, one that we greatly value, especially at this time in our history with everything that's happening in our modern day societies. I want to stop here for a response and an interactive discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that brilliant review, Daisry. Doctor, if you could please give us your view on the review that Daisry gave us, as well as the reflections of the book.
Yes, thank you very much, Honorable Masua. And thank you, Ms. Daisry, for that wonderful presentation on the book. Before we go on, I'd just like to say that I am in the situation where myths are beginning to be made about me. And one of them that began a long time ago, and not just today, is that I won the Commonwealth Writers' Prize. In fact, at the time, the Commonwealth Writers' Prize had a continental round where the different continents competed. So I won the prize for Africa and not the overall prize. So generally it is the Africa section that I won. And then the overall prize went on to be won by somebody else. So that's one thing I wanted to say. There's also the myth that I am more intellectually capable than I actually am. I am Ms. Dangarembga and not doctor. It would have been wonderful, but it didn't happen. So I just thought I would make that point. Yes, thank you. Daisry, the first thing that you said that really resonated with me, which was one of the first things that came from you today, was the need to tell our own stories. For me, this is the foundation to what I do now. I am active in writing literature. I'm active in filmmaking. I'm active in mentoring, particularly young women, in narrative, whether it is prose or whether it is filmmaking. I have written for the stage before. And all of this was because I found it necessary that we as Zimbabweans, as Southern Africans, as Africans, have their own stories. I grew up without such stories, and I can really count on my fingers the books about young Black people that I read when I was a young girl. One of them was Kamara Laye's African Child, about a girl called Fanta. And the other one was Chinua Achebe's No Longer at Ease, about a young man wanting to get married and ending up in corruption. And then those were really the only two that I read until I was a young adult. And as my education, especially my education in psychology, continued, I realized that this inability to see ourselves in literature was not contributing to our social development. And as I studied literature, as I studied psychology and film theory, I began to see how and why this kind of representation is so important. Because our brains react to narrative in a way as though they are real. And so the less narrative we see about ourselves, the less we are reinforced as subjects, as people who see themselves having agency in the world and being capable of doing things. Film theory, building on analytic theory, goes even further and talks about moments when children see themselves in the mirror. That a mother holds the child up to the mirror. The child sees itself in the mirror in the safety of its mother's arms and begins to relate to itself as an object as well as a person, but a person that is safe because it is in the mother's arms. And so representation in narrative takes this a little further. When a writer sits down to write a book, or a filmmaker sets out to make a film or any kind of narrative, even song, it is unlikely that that person is fueled by hate. It just takes so much energy and becomes such a part of one's own psyche that if one's narrative is fueled by hate, one is then taken over by hate itself. And hate is not a generative emotion, it is a destructive emotion. And so that negative emotion, that destructive emotion, would not be a power base that enables the narrative to build and to go forward in a way that draws people into it. And so you will find that most people who are in the business of narrative, especially creative fiction narrative, come from a place of wanting better for the self, wanting better for the next person, the neighbor, wanting better for the community. And characters are constructed to show this, to show that, you know, this might not be working, but maybe we could think about this with the aim of getting to a better equilibrium. And so when we read, we are taken in to that whole psychic landscape of wanting better, of being able to view what might not be working. But the book functions like the mother holding the child up because it's coming from this place of desire for betterment for everybody. And so this is why it is so important for us to have our stories. We always had them in the past before we came into the semi-modernity that we have now. But they served a different construction of society, our folk tales, which are still very important for us because they are part of our psychical history. But they served a different structure of society. So now we are in this kind of structure of society. We need the narratives that also serve that purpose in this structure. And I think that sometimes this is where some people are not really as aware as would be good for our nations, our regions, and our continent of the importance of having modern narrative. There is a tendency to look back, to say, look, we've got all these folk tales, let's go back to all that narrative and see what we can make with it. And I think that's really important too. One of my films actually does that. It goes back to look at folklore. That is important. But it transports us back to a psychic space that is not today. And we need to live in today's psychic space and deal with it, deal with the trauma of it. I will come to that later. So, the power of representation in telling our own stories is something that is actually formative. It's formative for individuals, it's formative for communities, it's formative for nations. And I am so glad that you have this platform, this virtual book club, because it shows that we are beginning to take this more seriously at higher levels in our countries, which is wonderful. So now I move on to women writing and women expressing themselves. I think this is also very important because our societies tend to be patriarchally conservative. And in that patriarchal conservatism, women are not expected to be as present, as expressive of their views and opinions, likes, dislikes, and inner life. So generally, you will find that where we are in a situation where things need to be said, stories need to be told, the men are at the forefront. Even on the continent, we talk about Chinua Achebe, who was writing in the 1960s. And it's only like in the last couple of decades that women from the continent have really come into their own in writing. And so I think it really is very important that we understand that the psychic life of 50% and a bit more of our nations, our communities, is very important to the wholeness of the life of the community. And one of the ways that people can express how they see the world, what is going on inside them, is by telling stories. There's a wonderful book that has just been published in Bulawayo now in Zimbabwe about women telling their stories, and it's called When Secrets Become Stories. And for me, that is so expressive of that space that women are often in, where things are happening, emotions are churning, depression, anxiety is setting in, wondering how one can cope, all of those things. And one is told, no, don't talk about it. Just as you were saying, Daisy, don't talk about it. As long as you can get up in the morning and go and do something, that's fine. So that becomes a secret. But now we're realizing that all that energy that is keeping those secrets down is energy that is not flowing out into our societies in order to build it up. And I think we are seeing a very good change there. So it is very important to give voice and to give platforms to those people who might not be at the forefront. I had a demonstration of this when I was working in Kenya with some people in the slums in Kenya. And we were trying to create spaces for young women to come into filmmaking. And it was so difficult for them. Not so much now, only because of the inner life and what people would say, but because of the practicalities. Whereas a young boy could get up and come to a workshop, a young girl had to be sweeping, had to be cooking, had to be looking after the children, and so she was excluded from those spaces. We're talking about literature today, but as you know, film is another very important and potent mode of narrative. And maybe you'll have a film club too one day, Daisy, and we can talk about why specifically film works in the ways that it does and affects the individual in the way that it does. It's very important to understand these things so that we can invest properly in these institutions of literature and filmmaking. So I'm going to go now and look at the book and just go through what Daisry told us and reply to it. Yes, the book really is about intersectionality, about all the different demographics that conspire to put people in certain places in society, even in our post-independence nations that we have. writing the book was really a journey for me, because I always say, if I am not moved by something I have written, then I need not have written it. I cannot be the same person when I have finished writing the book than I was at the beginning. If I am, this is me, other people write differently, but for me, I think I need to have learned something and transformed and grown also about the writing. So when I look at this intersectionality and all the demographics that conspire to place us in certain boxes, it is not to be hopeless. It is to say, hey, can we talk about it? To start a conversation, very much like the conversation we have today. Because in my country, at least, traditionally, conversations about things happening were not had by everybody. There were a few people who were designated to talk about the affairs, and everybody else got on with things. And everything was very much pragmatic, geared to getting things done. And there were very set systems about how one could engage with things that were not working for one. Which aunt you could speak to if you were a young girl and things were not working for you. Which uncle you could speak to if you were a boy. Who you could speak to if you were a woman married in. Who you could speak to if you're a young man who wants to go and get married. All that was there was a system that governed that kind of engagement. And now these systems have fallen apart. And what do we have in their place? I believe that our literature is one of the ways that we can begin to replace those systems. So when people read, they are confronted with some of the issues that are extant in the community around them. First of all, there's that act of recognition, I'm not alone. Then there is the act of talking about it, as we are doing here. And I believe that that can contribute to progress. So the first thing was the issue of ageism. Yes, I wrote the book as I was transitioning from not being young anymore into being older. And I was beginning to feel the impact of that as well. It was a natural progression, of course, for Tambudzai being the third one, but it was something that I was beginning to confront in my work, and especially in the area of filmmaking, which is visual and, therefore tends to be filled with wonderful looking young people. But I had also come up against this briefly when I had a stint in a political party. And I spoke to some of the women that I met there. And there was a lot of complaining about how older women are treated in politics. And there was a lot of complaining about how older women are not expected to have any ambition anymore, anything to offer, and just to be there to be figureheads of certain kinds. And so, although I was experiencing it myself, I also heard other women from other areas talking about it. And so I thought it was something that we could discuss as a nation, as the readership of that knowledge in the literature, because the reason why I think it's important to talk about it is that with medicine today, people are living longer. Women are living long past the time when they are occupied as mothers. Those of us who are mothers know how much energy being a mother takes up. But there comes a time when children are grown and women are still fit, they're still strong, they're still intellectually capable, they still have all the qualifications and experience. So one of the questions I am asking is, what are we doing with that resource to the nation? So ageism was one of the first things. Then there was one of the key things about this book was how we treat each other amongst ourselves as people in our nations or in Zimbabwe. And I'm going to use the word black because many of our nations still have white people in them. And so there is still a level at which race operates in society. And so I do sometimes want to specifically address people who have had the same experience that I have had. And that is very much determined by the color of the skin. And so sometimes I do really want to specifically address us as Black people and what we do amongst ourselves. So there were, when Tambudzai has to leave the hostel because she's getting too old, there is the moment where she goes to look for somewhere to live before she gets to the widow. And when she gets to this place, it is a white woman's house, and there is a domestic worker who receives her. And while Tambudzai is trying to get in, the dog of this woman, who is also a widow, but she's white, is going crazy and wants to bite Tambudzai. And I don't know whether you had the same thing in Namibia, but definitely in Zimbabwe, we had, before independence, a situation where dogs were trained to bite Black people, preferentially. And so one would have expected the domestic worker to then call the dog back and to open up so that Tambudzai can come in and do her business. But straight away, the domestic worker is on the side of the dog, wants to keep Tambudzai out because she feels she's in a position of power. If this Tambudzai has walked, hasn't even driven, but is so poor that she had to walk to the door, then I, with my job, am in a position of power over her. And I am going to use this power to deny her access. So that was one of the first comments that I wanted to make about how we treat each other as Black people. And then when we go to the widow, there is again a kind of a continuation of that. The widow that Tambudzai finally did live with is a wealthier person, wealthier than Tambudzai, although she needs to take boarders into her house. But again, it is this overbearing idea of self being better than somebody else. This idea that some human beings are better than other human beings, even amongst ourselves. So this was something that I really wanted to drive home, and it comes at several points in the book. I think, Daisry, you have spoken about the gender issues very well. One of the reasons why I wanted Tambudzai to be the figure who plots to go and have affairs and take married women away from their families is because I wanted to make it familiar to us. I wanted it not to be the thing that those bad women do, but I wanted it to be something that is happening in our society that we are part of, and to show the pressures that drive women to that kind of behavior on the one side, but also that allow people, the men who are engaged in that kind of behavior, to get away with it. Yes, there was the issue of the sexual molestation of one of the characters, but there's a very important figure, or at least a very important situation at the widows, and I don't highlight it. But the widow has her married sons coming to her house with their girlfriends, and she says nothing. As a mother, she says nothing. So what I was pointing at, hinting at there, is the way we as women who are mothers socialize our male children. We are the ones who allow them to behave in certain ways, and do not tell them that those are not good ways to behave. It's done very subtly, I think, because the widow is silent and the young men just have all these women all over the place and take booze out to them to drink, and she pretends she doesn't see it. So yes, there are many things that we pretend we don't see in our nations, and one of my aims in this mournable body was to say, well, can we talk about these things? Look at what is happening to our societies. Is what is happening to our societies what we want to happen to them? Most people would say no. Most people would say the economy is deteriorating. Generally, the society is deteriorating. So most people are unhappy. And so I would say, well, let's have a look at the causes of some of this deterioration and take responsibility for it. What are we doing to be part of that system? What can we do at personal levels, at family levels, at group levels to create another kind of way of being that will create people who could maybe have a better impact on these societies? I try to do it in a way that is not blaming. I try to do it in a way that is caring and understanding. And this is why I wrote it from the point of view as Tambudzai, who is a person who is doing a lot of these negative things. I wanted to make the point that, yes, that is what people do when they feel that they have no alternative and there is no option. As human beings, we have ranges of behavior that are open to us, and this range goes from good to bad. And sometimes we are in that position where we do not choose the best behavior. So let's talk about it and let's see how we can change things in order to improve the situation. In Tambudzai's case, it took a long time. You mentioned Daisry the school, and that was very important for me because I wanted to talk about violence and the way young people experience violence as a norm. Tambudzai didn't actually have children, so up until that point, I had no young characters with which to make this point. But the way our societies so often mete out violence upon young bodies is something that I really think contributes to our whole acceptance of violence as a culture. And so this is why I have Tambudzai have this this psychic breakdown while she's in class, and she goes for her student with a T-square, and as you said, she damages the student's ear. Now, this happens in our schools. Although corporal punishment is not legal, it happens. We do it in the home. In Zimbabwe now, we're in the phases of having it illegal to use corporal punishment on your own children, and there's debate about that. Is that the way to go? Is that not going to cause more problems? But I really do feel that we have come to a point, because we have lost the extended family, where, for example, if a father was beating up a child brutally and not in a way that was appropriate discipline, there would be an older adult there who would say, no, don't do that. I know that I experienced that in my life growing up. My grandparents would be the people to come and say, you know, don't be so hard on the child. And I know that as a mother, I have also, my children were glad to have their grandchildren available for that role. But all that is breaking down now. And so if we do not have those family and community circles that can extend that normative role, where is it going to come from? And definitely children are suffering from physical abuse in many settings, whether it's in the classroom, whether it's in the family. And my thinking is that if we normalize to children that you can be so physically abused and your body subjected to so much pain and it's okay, we are bringing that as a norm into society. And I think discussion is due as to whether that is the kind of norm that we want. It ties in also with mental health, because it seems that in our past structures of society, enduring things was a virtue. It was valued in society. The more you could endure, the better you were. And maybe that had value at that time, but we went through colonization where the intention was simply to extract as much as you could. So the more you endured, the more was extracted from you. We now have completely different social relations where simply enduring more and more does not seem to yield the personal value and the social value that it did before. In the capitalist exploitative conditions that we have, to endure simply seems to be to invite oppression and exploitation. So, coming from the violence, again with the mental health, I have Tambudzai in a mental institution, because we are becoming a society that has less and less support for the individual as our old structures broke down and continue to break down, but we have more and more pressures on the individual. And the figures on mental health in Zimbabwe are increasing, also suicide, including amongst young people. So this is a very important topic. You may have heard about the Friendship Benches, which is a mental health institution that was created by one of our psychologists here in Zimbabwe, where older women, those grandmothers again, are trained in the basics of counseling and are available. And it takes away the stigma of going to a psychologist. It takes away the cost involved. It takes away the stigma of maybe being put into a certain institution. And it's functioning very well. But that was because this particular doctor had seen the way that the systems of support, psychic support for the individual, had broken down. And really, the increase of cases of people who could not cope psychologically with the pressures that we are facing today in Zimbabwe. So that's a very positive story, that out of that situation, something positive came out. And I wanted to highlight that area of mental health, that it is something we have to look at on the continent. The other thing about Tambudzai's breakdown in terms of structuring the novel is that it allowed me to introduce some other characters. And this was her aunt, Mainini, Lucia, who had also been an ex-combatant. And so, along with one of the other characters that you mentioned, Daisry, Christine, that she had met at the Widows, who was also an ex-combatant, I now had two female ex-combatant characters who were active in Tambudzai's story. And that was something that was very important for me, because a lot of friends that I have grown up with since independence were actually women who had crossed the border and gone to fight. And their struggles are hard. I'm sure you might have something similar in Namibia, but the struggles of these women to be in society having returned have been very difficult for me to watch. And I felt that I wanted to highlight this also. We don't have a lot of discussion about it, but again, the internal well-being of women who went to fight, who are now viewed as being not quite your ordinary woman because you were engaged in that kind of activity. Whereas it's that kind of activity that even enables us now to be having this virtual book club to talk about. So that was another theme that I wanted to highlight there. And then we have the issue of returning to the village. Daisry, you've mentioned Tambudzai's bitterness, her ambition, which is always thwarted, the way that she cannot go forward. One of the things about Tambudzai is that her failure made her feel ashamed of herself, and it prevented her from going back to the village, because if you have left, when you return, you are meant to return victorious, and she was not doing that. And so it was important for me to find a way to bring Tambudzai back to the village. In doing this, I am saying, how are we going to bridge that divide, which is so stark in our nations, between rural societies and urban societies? We seem to be reproducing that enclave society of colonialism, which is one of the things that I had understood was to be broken down. How do we bring people together across those kinds of gaps? For Tambudzai, it was an ego thing, really. In fact, a lot of her failure was an ego thing, imagining that because she was educated, she was better than the village, not wanting to go back to the village until she could keep up that performance of being better. You know, if she had just accepted that I am just like anybody else, and so I can go back, then there would have been no problem. So yes, indeed, Tambudzai's ego had to be broken down so that she could become a part of the community again. Her ego had set her apart, even if it was unsuccessfully. This is a very interesting thing. When egos that are distorted are nevertheless big, but because of the distortion, they produce negative results. I think it is an important theme that we have. And we can understand why Tambudzai's ego was distorted, the way she had to fight. But at the end of the day, it's important to accept that, yes, this did happen. And this is who she was. And it was producing all these negative results, where if she had been able to use her negative positively, we could have had positive results. And so this breaking down of Tambudzai, the process that began when she was in the mental institution, it came to its culmination when she really had to face the result of what she had done in this ecotourism, which was to bring tourists to the village. And although it was not the norm for that community, the tourist companies had asked that the women dance bare-breasted. And so she had to watch her mother dancing in this way in front of people. And that is when she had this, she realized that she could not continue like that. And she had this moment of complete breakdown, and she hugs her mother. And so this is the fusion now of becoming one with the mother again, getting rid of all of that had been divisive and that had made her think that she was better, that in trying to be better, that had driven her to violence upon the bodies of other people and to accept things that are really not acceptable. And so at the end of the book, there is the sense that she has made this big step, or at least I hope so. You can tell me, Daisry, if it was like that. I hope there was the sense that she has made this big step. We don't know whether she will be successful, but she has taken that leap. And then she goes back to Harare to live with her aunt. Again, this aunt is her mother's sister, so it signifies coming back into the community. Those people that she had thought she should be better with are now people that she is just working with in a condition of almost equality. She actually goes to work for her aunt, which is quite a come down from her. So those were the things that I wanted to tackle in that book, and to tackle them in a way that was not finger pointing, that simply opened up space for us to see ourselves held up in the mirror, to see what we look like in that mirror in a loving way, to feel embraced and supported as that journey is gone through, and so that that could generate conversations that beyond the conversations might be generative in small ways. You know, every small change in an individual is contributing to the change that we want to see in our nations. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that elaborate response. We really got into your mind and we understood the motives, the desired outcome, and you have achieved that desired outcome. Our country, if we had to personify her demographically, should be a 21-year-old Black female, Namibia. I don't think Zimbabwe would be too different. So what you're saying matters because it resonates with a majority population that is so affected by the issues that you are narrating through this novel. And, you know, I picked out a few themes, and I don't want to extend our exchange because I want to give an opportunity for everybody who's following to have an intervention as well. But, you know, there are really two grand narratives that I'm trying to reconcile here. One is our past, our shared history, Namibia, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. As post-conflict societies, we have been tremendously, profoundly traumatized and injured. We've been divided. We have had to endure a lot. That tolerance that we have is because we learned it over time. We've been subjected to so much exploitation, dispossession, oppression, inferiority complexes put down us. And unfortunately, the divisions now are very deep. In Namibia, it was apartheid, it was Bantustans, racial lines. But I know in your context, you also had to deal with painful things like ethnic purging. Those things created divisions that we now need to overcome and reconcile and create a national identity and create a common belief, cultural standard, moral standard. And I think it is one of the undermining factors in our efforts for social cohesion, for nation building. And I also think it is one of the reasons why our generation is increasingly intolerant. So the intolerance, it's ironic, it's good, but it can be dangerous. I think that we have to be intentional, we have to be intolerant because patriarchy does not concede without a demand. And I'm recognizing more and more that as the casual disrespect and objectification of women continues, as violence and rape culture continues, we have to be the ones to challenge and to reject it the moment that we see any signs and symptoms of it manifesting in our, those violations around us and the people that we love. So we are increasingly intolerant because we've had enough, I think, and we're trying to shift the culture. But I do think we will be more successful when we go back to the fundamentals, where we go back to education, where we go back to where we teach these cultural norms. So I agree with you on leveraging the power of storytelling to normalize healthier self-concepts, healthier self-images, and cultural beliefs. And the other grand narrative that I'm seeing, the way it's playing out now in our modern context, the challenge is really with the digitization and the online information age. Everything is happening in full view, in public, and the abuse is more manifest, I think, online now. Maybe because African states are not yet fully digitally, in terms of the legal frameworks, the rights that we enjoy offline are not as robustly protected online. So there's a lot of abuse, there's a lot of a normalized culture really of abuse online. I find it also very ironic because social media has been such a powerful platform to facilitate dialogue, to bring in representation for marginalized communities, excluded groups of the society. But you'll find that in as much as it's a tool for social transformation, activism on violence, women's rights, GBV, the very same proponents for human rights, the very same anti-violence activists they deploy the same platform to exercise violence on others, mostly politicians. To agree with your observation on women in politics, women in politics are treated differently in the online world. But generally, I think public servants and maybe because of the levels of distrust, there's a normalized culture of abuse for public servants and women and children in particular, which is more pronounced online than it is offline. So you've said a lot. Let me park it here and allow more views from the moderator and the audience.
Thank you very much for those reflections, Daisy and Ms. Dangarembga. I think what stood out for me most in the book was how fragility in mental health leads to Tambo essentially raging out on her student. Also how, in the beginning, she seeks, ways to empower herself, ways to gain social status, ways to make a living for herself. But later on, she acts out in such selfish and violent ways in her endeavor to achieve these goals. Maybe if you, Ms. Dangarembga, and also Daisy, can tell us how still today in our African societies, because of this notion that a Black woman needs to suffer, that a Black woman needs to endure, how does that compare to perhaps somebody who does not go through the same intersectionality as a Black woman? What are the disparities in how difficult it is for a Black woman to self-empower, having to give 200, 300% just to have half of the opportunities that, for example, a white woman would have? I had a discussion 2 days ago with my team at work where we discussed how it's so difficult for us to, as a Black child growing up, you can't follow your passion because we're busy breaking cycles of generational poverty. You can't necessarily become a singer or a writer. It's not as easy as it would be for people who don't face the same intersectionality. And that was brought to life also in Tambu's story. Could we maybe reflect on the intersectionality that Tambu faced and how that affected her becoming violent, how that it feeds this notion that we have of Black women being angry. We're often asked, why are you so angry? Could we maybe look at those reflections? I think Ms. Dangarembga, if we could start with you, and then Ms. Mathias, if you could please also give us your views on that.
Thank you. Yes, I've just been doing some research. Well, first of all, I said thank you very much for the opportunity. And I went into the research that I've been doing on the history, let's say the last 500 years of Southern Africa, maybe the last millennium. And some of the things that I found out put into context this idea of the Black woman's rage. One of the things that I found out was about the brutality of the wars that are called the frontier wars in South Africa in the Cape, which went on from about the 16th century until the 19th century. And the brutality, especially of the British when they came into the Cape government in the 18th century, was legendary, to the extent that although British soldiers who had been taken prisoner, or settler soldiers who had been taken prisoner in the early wars from the 16th, 17th century, were not tortured. By this time, in the end of the 18th century, the early part of the 19th century, the reprisals were becoming so bitter that even women and children began to be involved in acts of torture against these people. So this speaks to a history of really vicious warfare, carried out with those weapons that colonial people brought with them, that left people feeling they had no option but to express their rage and pain through inflicting the same on other bodies. So we're talking end of the 18th century into the first part of the 19th century. And then around that same time, there was a particular colonial agent who developed the structure for British colonial administration in Durban. And he did it by setting up what the settlers would call a paramount chief, and using that paramount chief to institute the British system and administer it. And one of the things that happened is that the men who were already being affected by colonization were called together and were asked about how the laws were in traditional society, excluding women, because this person never spoke to African women. So everything that was codified was collusion between these two sets of men who were in this power relationship together. So the position of the African woman was never even conceived of at law, except as property in the way that this was put forward by these men that were invited to speak. And so this became the system that was used in all the British colonies throughout. So the African woman has not seen herself in law for a long time. The law is another symbolic system. It's another representational system. And so we had experienced ourselves as lack. Our mothers had experienced themselves as lack in this representational system of the law. And of course, it affects you. And a normal response to this being made to be lack, which is being made to appear as though you do not exist, is to want to defend yourself, to say, yes, I'm here. I have to do X, Y, and Z in order to continue. And so this is where that rage comes from. It comes from not being allowed to be as the person you are with all the representational systems which become systems of power, both at the personal level and in the society, making a cipher of you and having to determine that, no, I am not a cipher. Can you imagine the amount of energy and force and power that is necessary to even be able to express anything in a situation like that? That is what Black women had to cultivate. And then you had that system that was taking away the people who were meant to be your helpers in managing affairs, so that their energy could go into that colonial system. And you, who are representationally in the system a cipher, now have to bear the burden of maintaining the community and the family on your own. Can you imagine the amount of raw energy that African women had to just grab out of the universe to be able to manage? And can you imagine how explosive that energy is, and how anybody who is seen as trying to make things worse, less possible for them, is going to get the full blast of that energy? It was the only way that we survived, and we were not meant to survive. And so part of that calling us anger, for me, can be interpreted as a kind of negative surprise at the fact that we survived at all.
So I'm not going to add to this response because I think I don't want to take away from what you've just said. I'm seeing a lot of positive comments, contributions in the chat that we should bring into this discussion. Some questions directed to you specifically, Tsitsi.
Thank you very much, Daisy. I see we have a comment by Ms. Ada Angula saying, and I quote, "I found the main character hypercritical of herself and her friends and family, One of the zingers I highlighted was in chapter 12. You begin to suspect that cousin, brother-in-law, and Nyasha are not being honest, that they found each other because neither possesses the hardiness success requires. So they dressed discouragement up in the glamour of intellect. There are a lot of people like this in Namibia, so disillusioned by their own struggle that they look at anyone who is at least trying to make do with what they have with contempt. Similarly, she undermines the cousin with a security company, which is a sad fate that she ends up working for. She also says there were a few symbols in the book of mental illness that she was grappling. I understood the bag of maize showing up everywhere was a reminder of the village she wants to shake off. I am not clear about the ants and the hyena. What do they represent? And then James Strauss also says, can we have a television series adaptation of the Tambudzai trilogy, please? And then finally, a comment from Unje Shivikwa. Normally we have heroes in a book. I started reading the book thinking Tambudzai was going to be this heroine, but she was far from this. She was flawed. She was silent in the taxi incident, the house sharing incident. She didn't help her student from a good place. It was from a selfish place. She was selfish. Her character made me angry, as at times I saw myself in her ambitions, her feeling that she's falling behind her peers, even though she was afforded an education, given the tools to progress. The book left me with a sad feeling of, is life just about suffering and enduring? Those are a couple of comments. So if you could perhaps reflect on those comments and just give us your closing remarks, as we're slightly behind with time.
Yes, thank you very much. So yes, I think this characteristic of Tambudzai, that she is hypercritical of herself and everybody, and becomes contemptuous of anything that anybody else tries to do, is something that we see very much in Zimbabwe as well. I think it is the basis of what the PhD, the pull her or him down syndrome. And I think Daisry, you mentioned this too, that when we have been through a historical system that was meant to subjugate us and to break us in our humanity, we are very traumatized. And I think that these kinds of reactions, which are unhealthy, some of the ways that we have reacted to that historical trauma, which continues today in the conditions of coloniality that we live in today. And again, it was something I wanted to highlight. Although it is not a pleasant thing, I think it is something that we do need to start engaging with. Not to feel guilty about it, but to realize that people behave in ways because things have happened. So once we can accept that, we can then start looking at the ways and saying, how can we change the ways? But if we cannot look at the ways, I think we cannot change them. So for me, that is very important. Yes, indeed, the bag of maize was the symbol of the mother. So although Tambudzai had tried to distance herself from her mother, that distancing was not, in fact, real, because the mother's love followed her in the form of this bag of maize. And one can think about that love when Tambudzai goes back to the village and does these terrible things. But we see that that connection between the mother and daughter did triumph. The ants really are just, I understand that alcoholics, people who drink too much, have the sensation of ants on their body. So that is what I put in there. And the hyena, the hyenas feeds on carrion, on dead flesh. So the fact that Tambudzai hears it was meant to evoke the idea of the decay that she is going through, although it is mental rather than physical. As for a television series, I would love to have a series of the trilogy, and I hope somebody out there who does that kind of thing is interested. I am not a fan of adapting. In fact, I do not adapt my own literature. The way I approach literature is different from the way I approach film, and I like to keep them separate. Yes, Tambudzai is not a hero or a heroine um, because we have so few of them. And I feel that at this moment in time in Zimbabwe, we had a heroic phase after the liberation struggle in the early days of independence, where we were so impressed with how heroic we were. And I feel that if we had really been as heroic as we thought we were, we might have had a different trajectory. I do not think that being heroic leads to decline. And yes, there are many pressures that cause that decline, but the definition of being heroic is being able to engage successfully with those pressures. So I think that the time for heroism might be over, and it might be time to look at flaws, which is what Daisry also mentioned, that Tambudzai is a flawed character. Now, I'm sure there are people who don't read the book to the end, but there are many people who do read it to the end. And this is to prove that even if you are a flawed character, you can still be loved. People can still root for you and want the best for you and want you to get over your flaws. So it is good for us to know that that is possible and to start doing that for ourselves, to say, well, okay, I have this flaw. To do it at the personal level, the family level, community, provincial, whatever, national, regional, continental, global. You know, we need it at the global level also. I think we are at a time when we see that we do not have heroes, whether it is in our part of the world or elsewhere. When we look at the people who are being held up to us from other parts of the world or people who are in positions of influence, very few of them are behaving in heroic ways. And so I think maybe it is time to think about flaws and how flaws can be made into strengths. So that's how I would end. Beyond thanking you very much for this wonderful conversation. And I really love talking about my work with people in this part of the world because it is written from the point of view of this part of the world. And this is where I would hope it had its most impact.
Tsitsi, thank you very much. We say thank you to you for joining us for this discussion on a definite excellent piece of literature. Personally, you know, when I started reading the book, I read it from an academic approach, but the book sort of drew me into reading it from a personal, a literature sort of approach. So thank you very much for that. Daisry, thank you very much for the initiative. I'd like to invite you to please all join us on the 24th of July for the next book, where we'll be with author Gwen Lister on her book, Comrade Editor, a memoir by Gwen Lister. Daisry, if you could just give us the closing remarks and also just the message of thanks to the author before we close the discussion.
Tsitsi, thank you very much. You have been gracious with your time. You've been courageous with your voice. Namibia, we are happy that we can have a friend like you that we can call on every once in a while when we are having these kinds of important, reflective, and very real, honest conversations. Thank you for the contribution that you're making, and continue to follow the work that we're doing here in Namibia, as we will continue to support and follow your good work as well. We wish you well during this pandemic. Stay safe and continue to make your contribution. Thank you to everybody who has joined us. Until next time.